The British royal family we know today are just one generation amongst a remarkable monarchy, spanning over 1,000 years. But how did an ancestry that once ruled the lands eventually forfeit power? With over a millennium of bloody succession wars, global conquests, betrayals, and grand stone buildings still standing tall, all royal history has been documented and preserved. With countless kings and queens, each with their own stories, this is the entire history of the British Monarchy. Our story doesn't begin with the Scots, or with the English for that matter, but with a Saxon prince named Egbert III. At the time of Egbert III's birth in 771 AD, England did not exist. Instead, the British Isles looked like this: a patchwork of warring kingdoms made up of Angles, Saxons, Jutes, and Britons, all fighting one another for control and influence over the Dominion. Born to Ealhmund, King of Kent, and grandson of Aoife, King of Wessex, the young Prince Egbert had strong claims to both territories. His father died when Egbert was 10, and a bloody scramble for the crown ensued. It eventually came to rest on the head of Beorhtric of Mercia. A young Egbert challenged Beorhric's rule and lost. Forced to take refuge in the nearby court of Mercia, and eventually sent into exile in Francia, Egbert was forced to bide his time. Learning from the French courts of Charlemagne and gaining experience as a military leader on the continent, Egbert grew into a king who was about to change the course of English history. In 800 AD, after the death of Beorhtric, Egbert crossed the Channel, returning to the land of his father, and made his claim to the throne of Wessex. Despite overwhelming support in both Europe and within the Wessex nobility, Egbert's ascension was by no means easy. Threats from nearby kingdoms were constant, and after losing his brother-in-law on the day of his ascension to an invading army of Mercians, Egbert was finally crowned King of Wessex in 802 AD. Immediately, he set about consolidating his power. He took control of the kingdoms of Kent, Essex, Sussex, and Cornwall, as well as large swaths of Wales. Even the kingdom of Northumbria eventually submitted to the crown of Wessex, placing all Anglo-Saxon kingdoms in Britain under the direct and indirect rule of Egbert of Wessex. Well, almost all. His old enemy, the Kingdom of Mercia, was a different story. The two sides had been locked in a constant state of warfare for centuries, with each kingdom trading territory and blood as the years wore on. King Egbert of Wessex would see brief success driving the King of Mercia, Wiglaf, out of his lands, but he was unable to hold them, and Wiglaf returned only a year later. Despite this though, the Anglo-Saxon chronicles remember Egbert favorably. For his role in uniting the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms of Britain, they bestowed onto him the title of Bretwalda, or Wide Ruler of Britain. And while he was never able to fully conquer the Mercian crown, his rule changed the landscape of Britain forever. Egbert of Wessex set in motion a policy of consolidation and expansion that his offspring would continue to enforce for the next 200 years, eventually leading to the unification of Britain and the birth of England. But there's still a lot of mess before we get there. King Egbert of Wessex died in 839 AD and was succeeded by his eldest son Ethelwulf, who soon faced a new threat: the Danes. Adorned in animal skins and brandishing axes stained with blood, the Danish invasion officially began in 842 AD. While Ethelwulf was victorious at the Battle of Aclea in 851 AD, driving the Danes back into the seas, he knew that this was just the beginning. The new threat worried the kingdoms of Britain so much that it forced Mercia and Wessex into an uneasy alliance with one another, putting an end to an almost 300-year conflict. Ethelwulf was succeeded by his son Ethelbald, whose reign was short and unpopular, especially amongst the clergy. This was mainly because of the new king's decision to marry his father's widow, something that even at this time was considered weird. After just 4 years of rule, Ethelbald died, passing the crown of Wessex onto his younger brother, Adalbert. Like his father before him, Adalbert too was threatened by foreign invaders from the north. Viking raids along the coast, led by Ragnar Lodbrok and his son Ivar the Boneless, had been growing in violence and frequency, with Viking forces even sacking the Wessex capital of Winchester in 865 AD. Adalbert rallied his troops and drove the Vikings back, but died of unknown causes that autumn, leaving the throne to his younger brother, Aethelred I, who was about to inherit an island on the verge of a major upheaval. The same year of Aethelred's ascension, 867 AD, the Vikings captured and settled the town of York, establishing the first major Danish foothold on English soil. Aethelred had no choice but to meet the great heathen army in battle. Together with his younger brother Alfred, they gathered an army and marched out to defeat their invaders. The cautious King Aethelred was defeated at the Battle of Reading in 871 AD, but was saved by his younger brother at the Battle of Ashdown the same year. Impatient as only the young are, Alfred took his army while King Aethelred prayed and met the Danes in open battle. He pushed the Viking horde back and bought his brother's kingdom some time, but the Danes rallied and struck the armies of Wessex again, securing victories at the battles of Basing and Merton. Aethelred died from his wounds, leaving the throne to his younger brother Alfred, who now inherited a kingdom on the brink of collapse. In 874 AD, the Great Heathen Army marched on the Kingdom of Mercia, defeating Burgred of Mercia and forcing the king into exile. With Mercia defeated, all that stood between the northern invaders and total control of England was Alfred and the Kingdom of Wessex. As Danish forces closed in all around him, Alfred was pushed back and forced into a remote marsh in Somerset. He'd been betrayed by his allies, who now chose to negotiate with the invaders rather than fight. Total Danish control of Britain looked imminent, but the young king had not given up hope. He emerged from the marsh and surprised the Danish army in Edington, chasing the Danish king Guthrum back to his base in Chippenham and forcing the Danes into a siege. Guthrum held out for 2 weeks before he surrendered to Alfred's forces, and Alfred was victorious. The terms were simple. Guthrum was to leave Wessex and receive a Christian baptism. The Danish king obliged, and after his baptism was solemnized at Wedmore, he retreated to East Anglia, leaving Alfred to consolidate his gains. Victorious, Alfred took on a new name, Alfred the Great. With the Viking threat tamed, Alfred set about transforming Anglo-Saxon society for the better. He established fortified towns throughout his kingdom, built schools, and encouraged the acquisition of knowledge. There's even an unsubstantiated myth that he founded Oxford University. But perhaps his most important policy was the establishment of Dane law. England was to be divided. The south and east belonged to the Saxons, and Saxon law applied, while the north and west belonged to the Danes, and thus were subject to Dane law. This divide is still seen culturally, politically, and financially in Britain today. Alfred brought Anglo-Saxon England into a golden age. He tamed the Danish threat and kickstarted a new age of Saxon rule that permanently changed the landscape of Britain forever. Alfred the Great was succeeded by his son, Edward the Elder, in 899 AD. Edward was in many ways like his father, learned, pious, and a keen military tactician. His reign focused on 2 things: improving the administration of his lands and increased expansion both north and south. He was able to capture the Viking capital of York, but only held it for a year before he was forced to abandon it. He also successfully defeated the Viking presence in southern England, and now either directly or indirectly ruled over all the old kingdoms, barring Northumbria, which was still under Viking control. Edward the Elder died in 924 AD from wounds he received while quashing a Mercian rebellion in Chester, and passed his crown onto his son, Athelstan. After consolidating his power at home, Athelstan set his sights north and did what his father could not. He conquered the kingdom of Northumbria and took control of the Viking capital of York, conquering the last Viking territory on the island and pushing the Danes into Scotland. He continued his campaign into the Scottish territories, and after heavy losses on both sides, he emerged victorious at the Battle of Brunanburh, forcing the Scottish king to pledge overlordship to him. This made him the first true ruler over all the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms in Britain, with his control extending from the shores of Cornwall up to the highlands of Scotland. By uniting the Anglo-Saxons, Athelstan formed the Kingdom of England and is thus remembered as the first real English king. With the realm now firmly under his control, King Athelstan continued the policies and reforms of his grandfather, Alfred the Great. He centralized government, brought about massive legal reform in the realm, and concerned himself with European politics in a way his predecessors seldom had. He died in 939 AD, passing the throne onto his half-brother, Edmund the Magnificent. Edmund's reign would be almost entirely focused on keeping his half-brother's kingdom together. He faced continuous threats from the Danish, who had now settled north of the border. Shortly after Edmund's ascension, they revolted against the new king, retaking York and mounting destructive raids on the Midlands. But like his predecessor, Edmund the Magnificent wasn't to be messed with. Leading his army north, he briefly stopped to quash a Welsh rebellion that had been brewing since before Athelstan's death. He then defeated the Danes at the Siege of Leicester and sent his armies into Scotland, seeking revenge against the King of Strathclyde for his decision to side with the Danish during the recapturing of York. He deposed the King of Strathclyde and installed Malcolm I of Scotland on the condition that Edmund would have overlordship of the territory. This gave Edmund control, directly and indirectly, of the entire island of Great Britain. But for all his successes, Edmund the Magnificent could not escape a violent death. In 946 AD, while attending a St. Augustine's Mass in Gloucestershire, Edmund was attacked and killed by a thief named Leofa, who the king had previously banished for his crimes. Edmund the Magnificent was buried at Glastonbury Abbey, and the realm scrambled to find his successor. Since Edmund's two sons were too young to rule, the burden of the crown fell to Edmund's brother, Edred, who reigned for 9 years before succumbing to an unknown intestinal illness in 955 AD. Edmund's eldest son, Edwig, was now 15 and took the crown as his own. He decided to split the realm between himself and his younger brother Edgar, ruling everything south of the River Thames, while Edgar ruled the north. King Edwig's reign was short, with the young king dying just 4 years after his coronation. He passed the Kingdom of England in its entirety to his younger brother, Edgar the Peaceful, in 959 AD. His reign was, as the name might suggest, considered a peaceful golden age where England was free from external attacks and internal disorder. He introduced a standardized coinage and was at the helm of the English Benedictine religious reforms that swept across the realm. But this peace did not last. His death in 975 AD thrust England back into a period of conflict and uncertainty. The throne was disrupted by Edgar's two remaining sons, Edward the Martyr and Ethelred the Unready. Edward successfully took the throne in 975 AD, but was murdered just 4 years later in circumstances not totally clear to us today. His younger brother Ethelred soon took charge at just 12 years old. Before the young king had even a hair on his chin, an old enemy reared from far in the north. The Danes had returned and set about raiding English territories again. With every year, the threat grew more serious, and soon the English king could not afford to ignore them any longer. He gathered his armies and marched north, but was eventually defeated at the Battle of Maldon. Seeking a compromise, King Ethelred II was forced to pay off the Danish king and leave them to settle in the Kingdom of Northumbria. But, as it turns out, the king was not content to just let the invaders be. A decade after his defeat, he ordered the infamous St. Brice's Day Massacre, a brutal slaughtering of a Danish settlement which had dire consequences to not only his rule, but his entire family's place in history. Hearing of the attack on his people, King Svein Forkbeard of Denmark sailed to England, forcing Ethelred to flee to Normandy in 1013 AD. Svein Forkbeard ruled over England for just 4 weeks before his sudden and mysterious death. Seizing the opportunity, Ethelred returned and quickly retook control of the crown. Despite the brief Danish interruption, Ethelred's 37-year reign was the longest of any Anglo-Saxon king, and it would become the last period of royal stability until the 12th century, almost 100 years later. King Ethelred the Unready died in 1016 AD, and the crown was passed on to his son, Edmund Ironside, who, like so many of those before him, was now forced to clean up the mess his father had made. You see, unbeknownst to Edmund, the Danish King Svein had a son, Canute the Great, who had been amassing an army in Denmark and preparing it to sail to England. Just weeks after the death of his father, and with the coronation wine barely out of his system, Edmund was forced to meet Canute and the Danes in battle. He was unsuccessful. With Edmund wounded, the two reached an agreement. Edmund Ironside was to rule Wessex, while Canute could have the rest of the country. This was October 30th. By November 18th, Edmund was dead, and Canute assumed kingship over the entire realm. After 214 years of hegemony, the House of Wessex had officially lost its control over England, ruling uninterrupted since Egbert III in 802 AD. 1016 would prove to be the dawn of a new age on the British Isles, the Age of Danes. After centuries of Danish activity on the island, a Danish king now sat on the English throne. Canute the Great was crowned in 1016 AD, and wasted no time proving he was an astute leader and capable king. He understood that to rule the English, he would need their help. He appointed English counselors and clergymen, choosing to uphold the traditional customs and values of the land he'd inherited rather than to suppress them. He married the widow of Ethelred the Unready and allied himself closely to the church, all of which helped Canute cement his legitimacy in 1017 AD. In 1018, he was crowned King of Denmark and later conquered Sweden, uniting the three kingdoms to create the North Sea Alliance. Medieval historians look back on Canute's reign favorably. His presence brought stability to England and allowed the realm to flourish now that the threat of Viking raiders had been eliminated. He died in 1035 AD, and the crown was to be given to his son, Harold Harefoot. Harold had not been the first choice for succession, but with his older brother Harthacnut stuck in Norway dealing with a Swedish rebellion, therefore it was decided that Harold would be appointed king instead. This was not a popular decision, and many in the realm opposed it, most notably Godwin the Earl of Wessex and Emma of Normandy, Harold's stepmother and the widow of Ethelred the Unready. She'd had 2 other sons while with Ethelred, both of whom had been exiled to Normandy after the Danish conquest. But now, with Harthacnut absent and Harold struggling to consolidate his power, she called on them to return to England and take back their father's throne. Alfred the Noble and Edward the Confessor sailed across the Channel with a large army and sought support from the House of Wessex. But Godwin, who'd initially opposed Harold's claim to the throne, betrayed the young princes and seized Alfred the Noble with the aim of delivering him to Harold Harefoot. Fearing he would be next, Edward the Confessor fled back to Normandy, this time taking his mother with him to safety. During his captivity, Alfred the Noble was blinded and eventually succumbed to his wounds in 1036 AD. Harold would rule for just 4 more years before dying in 1040. Hearing of his half-brother's passing, Harthacnut returned from Scandinavia and crowned himself King of England that same year. But like his brother, his reign too would be short, and he died in 1042 AD from an unknown illness. He had no sons, and during the last years of his life, perhaps encouraged by his mother Emma of Normandy, He called his half-brother Edward the Confessor back from exile and named him as his heir. King Hardignut's passing would mark the last time a Dane sat on the English throne. With Edward now on the throne, England was once again ruled by an Anglo-Saxon king. Except, Edward was only really Anglo-Saxon by blood. He'd spent 25 years of his life in exile in Normandy, and as a result, had an extremely Norman outlook on things. He appointed Norman counselors and Norman church leaders, and opted to speak French as opposed to Old English. He is best remembered as the founder of Westminster Abbey, still a major landmark in use in London today. As his life drew to an end, and with no sons to succeed him, Edward was expected to choose an heir. He was left with two options: Harold Godwinson, a prominent Earl of Wessex, and William, Duke of Normandy. Choosing Harold made more political sense. He was Anglo-Saxon and came from a prominent family, with ties to both the court of King Edward the Confessor and the former Danish king Canute the Great. Meanwhile, William had been an aide to Edward during his exile in Normandy and was related to the Anglo-Saxon king through Emma of Normandy, who was his aunt. The issues that arose from Edward the Confessor's succession was that it wasn't clear what the king had wanted. There are rumors that he'd promised the throne to William, but those claims are unsupported. In 1065 AD, Edward the Confessor slipped suddenly into a coma, never clarifying who was to take over the English crown. Edward died on the 5th of January 1066. A day later, Harold was crowned King of England at the newly built Westminster Abbey. Upon hearing the news of Harold's ascension, William of Normandy was outraged and began preparing to invade the island. What followed was a brief period of warfare that was about to shape England forever. King Harold found himself in an unfavorable position. He knew of William's invasion force and gathered his armies along the coast, expecting the Norman Duke to set sail soon after he had been crowned. But William didn't. Bad weather made the channel too rough to sail across, and William was forced to postpone his invasion by several months. Back in England, and with provisions starting to run out, Harold was forced to disband his army and return to London. That same day, on the 8th of September 1066, a new threat appeared, only this time far up north. Harold Hardrada, King of Norway, had arrived in Northumbria and defeated the English earls in charge of protecting the northern kingdoms. Harold had no choice but to react. He hastily regrouped his army and began a forced march north of nearly 400 kilometers to meet the Viking invaders. It took 4 days for King Harold and his men to reach modern-day Yorkshire, but on the 25th of September, they faced off against the Norwegian army at the Battle of Stamford Bridge. Just outside the city of York, the English army clashed with the Norse invaders. Hardrada was killed and Harold emerged victorious, stopping the invasion dead in its tracks. But Harold had little time to rest. Just 2 days after his victory at Stamford Bridge, word reached the king that the Norman invasion fleet had finally set sail for England. He gathered what men he had left and began the 400-kilometer march back to the English capital. Meanwhile, William of Normandy and around 7,000 men landed at Pevensey Bay in East Sussex and quickly took control of the old Roman fortifications nearby. It took King Harold and his army a week to reach the southern English coast, and Harold hoped his speech would catch William and his men by surprise. But Norman scouts had spotted Harold's army moving down and warned William of the king's arrival. On October 14th, 1066, a date forever etched in the annals of British history, the two armies clashed. The battle began at 9 a.m. and lasted the entire day. The English shield walls initially stood strong, surprising the Norman Duke and forcing him back, but William had come prepared. While Harold had only foot soldiers, the Norman Duke had brought with him cavalry and archers to supplement his main force. The Norman army feigned a retreat, which prompted the English troops to rush forward. This allowed the Norman cavalrymen to rout the disorganized English foot soldiers and slaughter them where they stood. Harold, the last Anglo-Saxon king of England, was killed by an arrow which struck him in the eye. Harold's mother reportedly begged William for her son's body back, offering to pay his weight in gold for custody of her son's corpse. But William refused. Legend has it he threw the body into the ocean, allowing the waves of the English Channel to swallow the Saxon king, never to be seen again. William of Normandy was victorious. He marched on London, burning his way through southern England and forcing lords to swear fealty to him as he went. He was crowned on Christmas Day 1066, marking the beginning of the Norman Age of England. His ascension to the English throne earned the Norman Duke a new name, William the Conqueror. As king by conquest, William now faced the unenviable challenge of consolidating his power. He brutally punished those who had stood against him by confiscating their lands, removing their royal titles, and executing anyone he deemed a threat to his rule. Families that had remained neutral during the invasion or were quick to pledge their support to William after it were rewarded and allowed to continue operating as they had before. Some were even allowed to marry into the new royal family. But a change in leadership was not all William brought with him. One of his most enduring policies was the construction of motte and bailey castles throughout his kingdom. Initially made from wood and later rebuilt with stone, these fortifications became the landmark feature of William's rule in England. From Pevensey, where he first landed, to as far north as modern-day Newcastle, these buildings were a sign of William's strength and influence over the land. Historians estimate that around 500 of these castles were built within the first 20 years of Norman rule alone, and they gave William and those loyal to him a position from which to defend themselves against revolts and usurpers, of which there were many. William's first test came when his former ally Eustace, the Count of Boulogne, rebelled at Dover. Unhappy with his spoils of the conquest, he rallied local troops against the king and attempted to take Dover Castle. But he failed and was forced to return the land he had won. Next, the king was faced with a number of English rebellions further inland. There was Edric the Wild in Wessex, as well as Githa, mother of Harold Godwinson, organizing revolts as south as Exeter. William dealt with those rebellions swiftly and with relatively little bloodshed. But in 1069 AD, the North rose up in revolt, and William responded in what would later be known as the Harrying of the North. It was a put-down so brutal that it left the areas of York and Durham underpopulated for centuries after. But his show of force had done its job. England was now firmly in his control. With this stability, the king felt confident enough to travel between England and the continent with increasing frequency. After 1072, he gave up making the journey and spent the majority of his time in Normandy, leaving England to be ruled by his half-brother Odo of Bayeux and his wife Matilda of Flanders. It was during this time that the first ever national census was conducted in England. The dramatically named Domesday Book was, in effect, a royal survey of all the lands in England simply for administrative and tax purposes. Its name derives from the Christian Day of Judgment, and the aim of the project was to streamline and regulate tax collection in the realm. Its historical relevance cannot be understated, as it gave historians an incredibly detailed look into what life was like at the time of the Norman invasion, and it currently lives in the National Archives at Kew in London. A year after the book was completed, on the 9th of September 1087 AD, William the Conqueror died of dysentery while on expedition in France. As was the custom of the time, he divided his properties between his 3 living sons. Robert got Normandy, William got England, and Henry got money. While the new king, William, may have inherited his father's lands and name, he had unfortunately inherited little else. Crowned king a month after his father's death, he quickly established himself as an unpopular, greedy, and self-centered ruler. He was a poor administrator who frequently angered the church and provoked his nobility with an unpredictable temperament and unyielding attitude. It's perhaps no surprise then that after 13 years of rule, King William II met his end during a hunting accident, the details of which aren't totally clear, but it is reported that William stepped in front of a stray arrow, dying of his wounds on the spot. The man who shot the arrow, William Tyrrell, fled after giving his account of the ordeal. With King William II dead, the throne was to be passed on to his older brother, Robert, Duke of Normandy. But Henry, the youngest of the three, had other ideas. With Robert busy on the continent ruling as Duke of Normandy, Henry took control of the royal treasury in London and proclaimed himself King of England in 1100 AD. Robert did eventually challenge his younger brother for the English throne, but King Henry was victorious at the Battle of Tinchebray in 1106. Defeated, Robert was stripped of his dukedom and would spend the rest of his life in prison. Thankfully for England, Henry I turned out to be a much better ruler than his brother before him. He successfully expanded royal administration throughout the realm and further solidified the rule of law. He set up the Court of the Exchequer to directly handle all financial matters, something which greatly improved the processes of collecting taxes and granting charters. He ruled for 35 long, peaceful, and prosperous years during a time of great social and political change on the island. Many of the administrators King Henry had appointed were new men, obscure, untitled subjects who had risen through the ranks through sheer brilliance and ability and not simply because of their names. But tragedy struck Henry during his twilight years. His son and eventual heir to the English throne, William Adelin, died in the wreck of the White Ship while returning from France. The widower Henry was forced to remarry in the hopes of having another son. When it became clear Henry would not bear another son, he decided to name his daughter Matilda as his successor to the throne. This was an unprecedented move, and while many barons publicly swore fealty to the future empress, privately they had other ideas. King Henry I died in 1135 AD, believing that he had solved the issue of succession. Immediately, however, the barons of England abandoned the dead king's wishes in favor of a different claimant, Henry's nephew, Stephen of Blois. You see, the English nobility weren't keen on the idea of a woman ruling the country. English society believed a woman simply couldn't rule as effectively as a man. Patriarchal biases aside, Stephen of Blois was a well-known and well-liked figure within the Anglo-Saxon upper class. He was respected, well-mannered, decisive, and best of all, wealthy, traits that made him an attractive prospect to put on the English throne. Matilda, meanwhile, was stubborn, arrogant, and because she had been married off at a young age to the Holy Roman Emperor and therefore spent her life away from England, she was considered by many a foreigner. What followed was a period of English history that later came to be known as the Anarchy. The news of King Henry's death reached Stephen of Blois first, and he crossed the Channel and crowned himself king in 1135 AD, arguing that the stability of the land took precedence over any earlier commitments to support Matilda as Henry's heir. Matilda, who now was married to the Count of Anjou, was still in Europe, and news of her father's passing was slow to reach her. As a result, King Stephen enjoyed an early period of ruling that was free of turmoil and challenge. When news reached Matilda of Stephen's usurpation, she was furious. In 1139, she crossed the Channel and traveled to the court of her half-brother, Robert the Earl of Gloucester, seeking his support against the usurper king. Robert obliged. Trouble began in 1141 when the king's forces met Robert's army at the Battle of Lincoln. King Stephen is said to have fought bravely but was overwhelmed by Robert's men. The captured king was then taken to speak with Matilda. She immediately imprisoned Stephen at Bristol Castle and set out for London with one aim in mind, her coronation. But her attempts at becoming queen were soon halted. She faced bitter opposition from the crowds that had gathered in the capital. These were not soldiers, but ordinary citizens. Forced to retreat, her half-brother Robert was captured during the Rout of Winchester, and only by releasing King Stephen did Empress Matilda secure her half-brother's safety. With Stephen free once again, the fighting continued. Empress Matilda was herself captured at the town of Devizes, but managed to slip away from the king's men by pretending to be a corpse on a cart. She was again captured and this time held at Oxford Castle. But Matilda mounted another daring escape, lowering herself from the castle walls on a rope during a snowstorm. Wearing white so as to camouflage herself, the Empress traversed the bitter cold and made her way to the town of Wallingford by night, making sure to avoid detection from hastily formed search parties that hoped to find her. The war soon turned into a stalemate as neither side could claim they controlled much of anything. In 1153, Matilda's son Henry landed in England and began building his own alliances with power barons to support his mother's claim to the throne. But Empress Matilda had grown tired of the fighting and by now had retreated to Normandy, passing her claim solely on to her son. King Stephen was in a similar position with his rule undermined by the constant fighting, so he agreed to the Treaty of Westminster. It stated that King Stephen would remain king for life, and then Henry, the lawful heir, would succeed him as King of England upon his death. As it turns out, Stephen only lived for another year and died in 1154 AD, passing the English throne to Henry. From the ashes of the Civil War, England was reborn under a new family, one that would eventually rule over the island for almost half a millennia. Introducing the Plantagents. Henry II was crowned King of England on the 19th of December 1154 AD, and immediately set about fixing his kingdom. 18 years of civil war had taken its toll, and the realm his grandfather had ruled over less than a lifetime ago was now unrecognizable. The treasury was virtually empty, royal administration was almost non-existent, and local lords had slowly wrestled power away from the crown, weakening its influence in the realm. Henry began by restoring the power of royal administrations, as well as re-establishing English hegemony over Wales. He razed unlicensed castles that had sprung up during the anarchy, and reclaimed many of the rights and powers the crown had lost during the reign of King Stephen. Next, Henry focused on restoring the crown's finances. The war had disrupted almost all the king's traditional sources of income, and as a result, Henry inherited a kingdom that had lost an estimated 46% of its funding. Faced with an administrative nightmare, the king needed help. He was soon introduced to a cleric from London who had earned a reputation as an astute and capable administrator. His name was Thomas Becket. Ruthlessly efficient and brilliant at this post, Becket was appointed Lord Chancellor in 1155, giving him direct control over the king's sources of revenue. Becket was successful at his new post, and King Henry had a lot of admiration for the Chancellor. As a new man, Becket championed the idea set forward by Henry's grandfather, that of promotion through ability and not title. And even beyond this, the two men quickly became friends. The king even sent his son Henry to live in the Becket household as a young boy, highlighting just how close the two families really were. So, when the Archbishop of Canterbury died, Henry saw a golden opportunity. Wanting to reassert his rights over the church in England, which had been growing increasingly powerful in recent years, King Henry II encouraged a reluctant Thomas Becket to take up the position of Archbishop. It was a win-win for Henry. Becket was a powerful chancellor, and his new position as Archbishop would weaken him politically, meaning Becket would have to rely more on King Henry for support. Moreover, Henry assumed his old friend would act in the crown's best interest, weakening the church's growing influence over the Kingdom of England. But he was wrong. Almost immediately after his ordination in 1162 AD, Thomas Becket changed. He abandoned his links to the royal family and fashioned himself as a new protector of religious rights. Henry's plan had backfired enormously. Their friendship did little to stop them from clashing on a number of issues, mainly the question of the supremacy of ecclesiastical courts. Put simply, during Henry's reign, clergy members could only be tried for their crimes in church courts. The king didn't like this, as it made the crown appear weak and subservient, implying that the church and its clergy were above royal ordinance. Add to this the fact that a huge portion of England's administrative body was made up of clergymen, and Henry was anxious to wrestle power back from the church. He argued that criminous clerks should be tried in royal courts instead. Becket disagreed. This enraged King Henry II, who was known for having a wild and unpredictable temperament. Fearing for his life, Archbishop Becket fled to France, where the Pope was forced to intervene, mediating a fragile peace between the old friends. Upon his return, Becket immediately angered Henry by excommunicating the bishops who had supported the king during the archbishop's exile. Henry flew into another rage, and 4 knights, perhaps hoping to curry favor from the king, rode to Canterbury and killed Becket on the steps of his altar where he stood. It was a shocking move, and one that Henry came to deeply regret. Filled with remorse, King Henry walked to Canterbury Cathedral in sackcloth and ashes, allowing himself to be whipped by the monks there. Becket was martyred, and the power of the church grew as a consequence. Henry's own demise would eventually come at the hands of his 3 sons. In 1173, the heir to the English throne, young Henry, rebelled against his father. Joined by his 2 brothers, Richard and Geoffrey, as well as several European states, the Great Revolt began, and King Henry II was forced to meet the rebels in battle. The revolt was only stopped thanks to Henry's talented local commanders, many of whom were new men appointed for their loyalty and administrative skill. Young Henry and Geoffrey led another revolt a decade later in 1183, but they were again unsuccessful and died a few years after. Philip II, King of France, swayed a neutral Richard to his side, and together they led one last revolt against King Henry II of England. With his army defeated, the king retreated to his castle in Anjou, where he died from a bleeding ulcer shortly after in 1189. Having forced his father off the throne, Richard prepped himself to take over. Richard I was crowned king at Westminster Abbey on the 3rd of September 1198. Fondly remembered in English history as Richard the Lionheart for his bravery and skill in battle, Richard's rule is unique, as he spent the majority of it abroad fighting in what would later be known as the Third Crusades. In fact, King Richard spent just 10 months in England before leaving to join Philip II of France on his crusade to liberate Jerusalem from Muslim invaders. Richard proved himself to be a brilliant military strategist, and he fought cruelly and decisively as he led his army deep into the Levant. His rivalry with Muslim commander Saladin became the stuff of legend, and the Crusaders were able to recapture a sizable portion of their territory back. But as a result, England quickly became an afterthought to King Richard. He used the realm mainly to finance his wars in the Middle East. After failing to retake Jerusalem, King Richard was captured by Leopold of Austria, a personal enemy of the English king, and held for ransom. John, the youngest of Henry II's children and brother of Richard, had been left in administrative charge of the realm. When news reached him of his brother's capture, he was hesitant to pay the £60,000 ransom. With help from the Archbishop of Canterbury and his mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, King Richard's ransom was paid and he was free once more. But Richard the Lionheart died as he lived, fighting. Struck by a crossbow bolt in France, the wound quickly turned gangrenous, and it was apparent to all that the king wouldn't make it. Richard reportedly asked to have the crossbowman brought before him and was surprised when a boy was thrown at his feet. The child said King Richard had killed his father and brother and that he had intended to kill Richard in revenge. He expected to be executed, but in one final act of mercy, Richard the Lionheart forgave him, saying, "Live on, and by my bounty, behold the light of day." Richard died in his mother's arms on the 6th of April, 1199. Chroniclers of this time said this of the king's death: "The lion by the ant was slain." With his brother now dead, John was crowned King of England in 1199 AD. Like his older brother before him, John too was given a nickname, although one far less romantic. He was called John Lackland, or Lack of Land, as he was not expected to inherit any significant lands upon his father's death. But as fate would have it, as the youngest of Henry II's 4 sons, John had not been involved in any of the wars against his father. and had therefore been given lands in Ireland and France as a thank you for his loyalty. Unfortunately, though, this was about as good as it got for King John. While Richard the Lionheart was an absent but popular king, John was the complete opposite. He was a poor administrator, a greedy statesman, and a terrible fighter, whose over-involvement in ruling led to a sharp decline in the power of the English crown. In 1204, he lost all his family's lands on the continent, severing the aristocracy of Normandy from England for the first time since William the Conqueror's accession in 1066. He was briefly excommunicated in 1209 by Pope Innocent III after an argument with his clergy, and was becoming increasingly unpopular with the barons of England for his poor leadership and decision-making. After failing to recapture his territories of Normandy, King John was forced to return to England and face a powerful rebellion from his barons. Unhappy with the king's new fiscal policies and demanding that their rights as nobility be respected, they forced the king into signing the Great Document, or the Magna Carta, in 1215 AD. The English crown changed forever that day, as the king agreed to be bound by common law and tradition, especially where it affected the rights and privileges of the nobility. It essentially put the crown directly under the rule of law, as opposed to the other way around as it had been since England was founded. Its impact was astronomical, although not immediate. While it was nothing more than a power grab by the barons of England, it eventually went on to form the basis of the English Constitution, and included several clauses that were later interpreted as definitions of democratic freedom and the rights of an individual under common law. King John had hoped that by signing the Magna Carta, he could appease his nobility and stop a war from breaking out in the kingdom. But once again, he was wrong. Still unhappy with King John's rule, the First Barons' War ignited in England in 1215. But despite backing from the King of France, the English barons were unable to score any decisive victories over King John and his men, and the war quickly became a stalemate. While on campaign, King John died of dysentery he'd contracted while overindulging on peaches. A fitting death, perhaps. As a result, the throne was passed on to his son Henry, who now had the unpleasant task of finishing what his father had started. At just 9 years of age, Henry III was crowned King of England on October 28, 1216. Inheriting a kingdom on fire, the new King Henry was faced with the challenge of ending the First Barons' War. The king's army was led by William Marshal, 1st Earl of Pembrokeshire, and servant to 5 English rulers before him. He was a brilliant commander and successfully defeated the Baron army at the Battle of Lincoln and the Battle of Sandwich that same year. With the barons defeated, they now had to answer to their new king. Henry showed great diplomacy and maturity by promising to abide by the Magna Carta, agreeing to limit his royal power and protect the rights of the nobility. With the rebellion quashed, Henry now turned his attention to repairing his kingdom. With the help of able statesmen and administrators, the next few years of King Henry's reign focused on regaining royal control that had been lost during the war. In 1230 AD, he had secured his power, and now well into adulthood, he set his sights on his father's greatest shame, their provinces in France. The English crown had never fully recovered from losing its grip on the Angevin Empire, and King Henry III sought to fix that. He prepared an invasion fleet, planning to take the territories by force and re-establish English control over land he deemed his birthright. But the invasion was a disaster. Perhaps on the advice of the 1st Earl of Kent, who had been ruling the realm on behalf of the young king while he was still coming of age, Henry avoided meeting the French in open battle and instead marched his troops across the countryside, forcing local barons and lords to pay homage to him. Some did, some didn't, and it was a pointless venture that didn't really mean much for English control in the region. Eventually, Henry was forced to return to England, having achieved nothing. As soon as Henry and his troops left France, those barons who had pledged themselves to him went right back to supporting the French king. The invasion had been a costly fiasco that made Henry extremely unpopular amongst his nobility. Hubert, 1st Earl of Kent, had now fallen out of favor with the king. and upon their return to England, Henry dismissed him, eventually imprisoning Hubert in the Tower of London. And the man chosen to replace him was no better. Peter de Roche took over as the king's justiciar and immediately set about reversing the policies of his predecessor. He stripped his enemies of land and wealth, circumventing the royal courts, and angering the nobility who believed that their rights were being infringed upon once again. Richard Marshall, the son of William Marshall, who had led the royal army in the First Barons' War, began to amass troops, only this time in support of the English barons. They argued that the king had again failed to protect their rights as outlined in the Magna Carta, and thus a new civil war broke out. Unable to gain a clear military advantage against the rebels, and with tension in France growing, King Henry had no choice. He agreed to the dismissal of Peter de Roche and submitted fully to the rebels' demands. King Henry had learned his lesson. Never again was England ruled through senior ministers, and the king now chose to administer the realm personally. The only problem was that Henry was not a good administrator. He filled the church with absentee Italian appointees, and much of the civil offices with French bureaucrats. Actions which unsurprisingly angered the nobility of England once more. This led to the barons to once again take action against the king. He was forced into signing the Provisions of Oxford, a document which gave barons the legal right to veto the king's decisions. Although initially supportive, King Henry tried to back out of the deal, which led to the Third Civil War of his reign. Led by Simon de Montfort, Henry's brother-in-law, the rebel army successfully captured King Henry at the Battle of Lewes in 1265. With the king now at his mercy, Simon called the first English parliament into action. From the French word for talk, or parle, he summoned 2 knights from each shire and 2 burgesses from each borough for a discussion. The men talked and created a new system of government on the island that is still in use in England today. King Henry's eldest son, Edward Longshanks, so named for his lanky build, had been captured alongside his father at the Battle of Lewes. Shortly after the first parliamentary discussion, Edward escaped, and within a few short months, he had defeated Simon at the Battle of Evesham in 1265. The Second Barons' War ended shortly after, and Edward Longshanks left England with his father, King Henry, once again on the English throne. In 1275, King Henry III announced his intention to embark on the Crusades alongside his son, but died just a few months later. Edward was recalled from the continent and slowly made his way back to the English shores. Landing on the island in 1274, Edward Longshanks was crowned at Westminster Abbey shortly after becoming King of England, inheriting an island that had suffered through 3 major insurrections in the last 56 years. King Edward I had his work cut out for him. He immediately set about reforming royal administration and reinforcing common law, writing a series of statutes that regulated criminal and property law in the realm. Edward had also learned from his father's mistakes and was more supportive of the demands of his nobility. He regularly convened with knights and townspeople alike on matters that affected them and quickly proved to be an able and just ruler. But despite his focus on repairing England domestically, King Edward could not help but be drawn into foreign conflicts. The first was a revolt in Wales led by a Welsh chief named Llewellyn in 1282. Here, the royal army came face to face with the brutal efficiency of the Welsh longbowmen, and despite taking heavy losses, they subdued the rebel threat. In an attempt to exert more control over the region, King Edward constructed a series of castles in the Welsh territory and increased royal presence in the region. His son, Edward, was born in Wales in 1284, and was soon after named Prince of Wales, a title that the heir to the English throne still wears to this day. In 1291, another foreign conflict called his attention, this time at the northern border. Asked to arbitrate between 3 rival claimants to the Scottish throne, Edward chose to crown John Balliol. The only problem was that John Balliol had previously paid homage to the English king, thus ruining any impartiality Edward was supposed to have. This angered the lords of Scotland, who in turn allied themselves with France, leaving England threatened on all sides. King Edward then retaliated. Claiming feudal suzerainty over Scotland, he marched his army north and invaded, defeating Balliol in 1296 and taking the Scottish crown for himself. He also took the Stone of Scone, an important relic of Scottish nobility where all Scottish kings were crowned upon. The stone is still used to crown British monarchs today and currently resides at Westminster Abbey in London. For his actions in Scotland, King Edward earned himself a new nickname. Edward Longshanks had become Edward the Hammer of Scots. Back in England, Edward was overseeing a rapidly transforming English government. He encouraged petitions to Parliament, with councils sitting much more frequently than they had previously, and he continued to clarify the responsibilities of the different courts. Criminal and crown cases were handled by the Court of King's Bench. The Court of the Exchequer dealt with royal finance, and the Court of Common Plea handled more of the day-to-day cases between subjects. From these roots, a new profession sprouted: lawyers. Needing to keep his new courts running smoothly, he took the profession of law away from the clergy and formed a new social class of educated young men whose job was to learn the law away from the influence of the church. This led to the establishment of the Inns of Court, great mansions where students and barristers lived together. The barristers taught the students English common law, along with necessary social skills such as music and dancing. These Inns of Court also set the precedent for other collegiate systems around the country. It was during King Edward's reign that the academic system we know today as Oxford University was founded, building on the earlier schools established by Alfred the Great over 200 years before. King Edward I died of dysentery in 1307 while fighting the Scottish up north. There is a rumor that on his deathbed, Edward wished for his bones to be taken with the army while they continued their fight into Scotland. Another rumor claims that Edward wished for his heart to accompany the next Crusaders as they marched into the Holy Land once more. Regardless, what these stories show is that Edward very much considered himself a warrior king. While he was a successful military commander, it was his administrative actions that had the biggest impact on England as a whole. The introduction of lawyers mingled with the burgeoning merchant class to form a proto-middle class, where before there had been none. Parliament was strengthened and legitimized during his reign, and despite his warlike tendencies, King Edward's reign was peaceful and prosperous for the average Englishman. King Edward I was succeeded by his son, Edward II, who was crowned in 1307 at Westminster Abbey. While his father had immediately launched into fixing the realm he had inherited, Edward II had no need to. His father's kingdom was flourishing, bolstered by great social changes and the newly inherited Scottish crown. It was a stable territory that was emerging as one of the most powerful kingdoms in all of Europe. But despite its power and prestige, the new King Edward appeared to almost resent the English crown that now rested on his head. He grew bored of his royal responsibilities and quickly turned his attention towards other pursuits: young men. The first of these deep infatuations the king would come to have was with Piers Gaveston. Gaveston was arrogant and well aware of his position as the king's favorite, abusing his power and coming to blows with many of the other barons of England. He was a close companion to the king, accompanying him everywhere, but this wasn't well received by everyone. Soon, Gaveston's behavior angered the French royal family, to whom Edward II had married into through his wife, Isabella of France. With pressure mounting from both his nobility and the French crown, King Edward II was forced to exile Piers Gaveston. But this didn't last long. By 1307, Gaveston was back in England and once again at the king's side. Parliament met in 1308 with the king eager to discuss potential government reform, but the barons were unwilling to proceed until the issue of Gaveston had been dealt with. The king was initially dismissive and a violent outcome seemed inevitable, but after the Archbishop of Canterbury threatened to have Gaveston excommunicated, Edward miraculously yielded. Gaveston was to be sent to Aquitaine, away from England for good. Unsurprisingly though, this did not last. The king once again recalled Gaveston, angering the barons and sparking an insurrection. After a period of cat and mouse between the king and the armies of his nobility, Gaveston was eventually captured at Scarborough Castle and taken to Warwick, where he was tried as a traitor.